In this video, I will discuss an influential theory about autism known as the weak central coherence theory. This theory was developed by Wuta Frith and her students. The word weak here may suggest that it's a theory about cognitive deficits in autism, but actually this is a theory specifically developed to explain superior abilities sometimes found in children with autism spectrum condition. Weak central coherence refers to a superior ability to process local details at the cost of processing the global whole. Early studies found that children with autism perform better on the block design subset of the Wechsler intelligence test than on other subtests. In addition, they were faster finding a figure embedded among other figures. So, for instance, they were faster finding the triangle embedded among this bigger picture here, relative to typically developing children. So, Frith proposed that children with autism show a weaker tendency to strive for global central coherence in information processing. However, the empirical evidence for this theory has been relatively inconsistent. What makes this literature conflicting is that we have not addressed a fundamental question about weak central coherence. In particular, does weak central coherence reflect a cognitive disability to process and attend to global information? Or does it reflect a preference, or maybe a disinclination of some sort, to processing global information? Both a disability and a disinclination could produce the same pattern of results in some tests, but they have different causes and call for different treatments. To address this question, we tested a large sample of children with ASD and age, gender, matched typically developing children. The two groups were additionally matched on IQ with a mean of around 110, so slightly above average. To test whether weak central coherence originates from a disability or a disinclination, we administered two tests on the same children. Both tests used hierarchical stimuli that could be processed at either the global or the local level. In the inclination test, we administered a categorization task. The test started out with three warm-up trials. For example, children were shown a picture of a dog and asked to choose a picture that matches it. Okay, here you would choose the puppy. The three warm-up trials were all straightforward and were there to make sure that children understand the task, and they include a picture of a dog, classification of a rooster, and classification of a number 3. All of the children tested in our study performed perfectly 100% on the warm-up trials, and that is, they understood what we wanted them to do. Then, without further instructions, we presented two critical test trials that involved hierarchical stimuli. On the first trial, children were shown a big triangle made of little squares. The choices were a big square made of little squares, matching the target picture on the local level, and a big triangle made of little triangles, matching the target picture on the global level. Note that we did not tell children what they should match on global or the local level. So this really is a test of preference, a style of information processing, and we did not provide any feedback on the response either. The next critical trial was similar, except that it was a big letter S made of little letter H's. Again, children could match either at the global or the local level. And we stopped the experiment right here because further testing would likely be influenced by strategies that the children gradually developed. If children had chosen the global match, we would assign a score of 1 on that trial. If they had chosen the local match, we would assign a score of 0. As we can see here, typically developing children, the control data, overwhelmingly classified at the global level. Okay. Children with autism showed a significantly reduced tendency, suggesting that they were less inclined to classify a hierarchical ambiguous stimulus at the global level. You may notice that the average was above 50%, meaning that even children with ASD were more likely to classify the stimuli at the global level than the local level. But it is important to point out that the exact level is not meaningful. Hierarchical stimuli like ours are notorious in that many factors can influence the relative salience of the local and global levels. If you blow up the stimulus, people are more likely to classify at the local level. If you make the elements small and dense, people are more likely to classify at the global level. So there is really not a true baseline. What is meaningful, however, is the finding that compared with typically developing children who saw the same stimuli, children with ASD showed less of a global preference in this task. But are those results due to a deficit in forming global shapes, or do they reflect a disinclination on the part of children with ASD in processing stimuli at the global level? To address this question, we administered an ability test by specifically instructing children to classify at either the global or the local level. In one block of trials, children were asked to focus on the global shape of the top one, so they touched the response patch that matched the top one at the global level. The global shape may be a solid one, this is the neutral condition, or it may be made of the same little shapes like a big triangle made of little triangles, this is the congruent condition, or the big shape made of another type of little shape like a big triangle made of little squares, this is the incongruent condition. Because children were told to classify at the global level, we took the inclination factor out and were testing primarily their ability to process global shapes. In another block of trials, children were asked to classify at the local level. Again, the stimuli may fall into a neutral condition with just a single little shape here, a congruent condition where the global and local shapes were the same, or an incongruent condition where they conflict. If children with autism are impaired at global processing, then they may be less accurate and slower in performing the global task relative to the local task. In addition, when the local and global levels conflict with each other, they should have greater difficulty ignoring inconsistent local shapes than ignoring inconsistent global shapes. This is a busy graph, so let me walk you over the results. On the y-axis is response time. The larger the number, the worse the performance. For typically developing children, when they had to classify at the local level, they were slower by an incongruent global shape, as shown here. Similarly, when they had to classify at the global level, incongruent local shapes also slowed them down to a similar degree. Children with autism were slower overall compared with typically developing children. But you can see here, when they were performing the local task, they were slowed down by an incongruent global shape, and this interference was substantial, suggesting that they too processed the global shape and had difficulty dealing with the interference. A similar pattern of results were shown in the global task, where incongruent local element interfered with performance. Thus, we observed qualitatively similar patterns of results between the two groups of children. There was no evidence that children with autism had specific difficulty in the global classification task, or that they were particularly impaired at handling interference from the local elements. These data led us to conclude that weak central coherence reflects a disinclination rather than a disability to process global processing. This concludes the third part of our mini-series.